The morning my parents left for their second honeymoon, my mother counted her jewelry into a velvet pouch 3 times. She zipped her suitcase, unzipped it, added a silk scarf, zipped it again. She kissed my stepfather on the cheek and asked him if he'd remembered the printed itineraries. She did not look at me once. I was sitting on the 3rd step of the staircase in pajama shorts and a thin t-shirt, and I had been sitting there for 40 minutes waiting for someone to remember I existed. I was 12 years old. We lived in a tall, narrow house on a tree-lined street in Savannah, in a neighborhood where the live oaks dripped Spanish moss over the sidewalks and every porch had a swing nobody used. My mother had bought the house 3 years earlier, right after she married my stepfather, a real estate developer named Beau, who smelled like cologne and cigar smoke, and who treated me the way you treat a chair you have to walk around to get to the kitchen. Not unkindly, just like an obstacle he hadn't chosen. My real father had died when I was 6. A construction accident. I remembered him in pieces, the way you remember a dream after lunch, soft edges and a feeling more than a face. My mother had a single-framed photograph of him on a high shelf in the guest room, and she only ever looked at it when she was alone. I'd watched her once, through the crack in the door. She had stared at that photograph for maybe 90 seconds and then turned it face down, gently, like she was tucking it back in, and walked out. That was the woman I lived with. On the morning they left, my mother set 3 things on the granite island in the kitchen: a $20 bill, folded in half, a debit card in my name, in a small white envelope with my full name written on it in her looping handwriting, and a single sheet of paper with the phone number of the housekeeper, Loretta, who came every other Thursday to dust and run the laundry. 3 weeks, she said. Beau and I are doing Tuscany and the Amalfi Coast, and then we're flying to London for his conference. You are old enough to understand what that means. I asked her what the debit card was for, and she said, groceries. Don't be silly with it. Loretta has the spare key if you lock yourself out, but try not to. She fixed her lipstick in the chrome of the toaster and slung her purse over her shoulder. The car will be here in 8 minutes, she said to Beau. And then to me, almost as an afterthought, behave yourself. I asked her where I should go if there was an emergency. She paused with her hand on the handle of her rolling suitcase. Use your head, she said. You're not a baby anymore. And then she was gone. I want to be precise about this because the precision is what nobody believed afterward. I was not a baby. That part she was right about. But I had also never been left alone overnight in my life. I had been to one sleepover, at a girl named Pippa's house in the 5th grade. And my mother had picked me up at 10 the next morning. I had never used the oven without supervision. I had never paid for anything more expensive than a school lunch. I had never been to the grocery store by myself because we lived a mile and a half from the nearest one, and my mother did all the shopping in the white SUV that she now would be parking long-term at the airport. The first day I made myself a peanut butter sandwich and watched the television in the kitchen for 6 hours. I felt a strange, jittery freedom, the kind of feeling I imagine a dog feels the first time someone leaves the back gate open. I called Loretta around dinner and she said, "Oh, sweetheart, your mama told me you'd be fine, just don't burn the house down." Okay, and laughed in a way that wasn't unkind but wasn't quite a hand reaching toward me either. The second day I took the debit card to the Publix down the road. I walked because I didn't know how else to do it. I filled a small basket with what seemed reasonable: a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter since mine was almost gone, a box of cereal, a gallon of milk, 3 apples, a package of sliced turkey. At the register, the cashier swiped the card and the machine made a polite little error noise. She tried again. Same noise. She tried a 3rd time and then said, "Honey, this card isn't activated. Do you have another way to pay?" I gave her the 20. I walked home with the bread and the peanut butter and the apples. I had to leave the rest. The cashier had looked at me with a kind of soft pity that I would think about for a long time after. The way an adult looks at a child when they realize the child has been sent on an errand that wasn't fair. When I got home, I called my mother. It went straight to voicemail. I called Beau. Same thing. I called my mother again and left a message saying the card didn't work and I needed her to fix it. I did not cry on the message. I had learned by 12 that crying on a voicemail to my mother would be filed away as evidence of being dramatic. and any reasonable request packaged in tears would be denied on the grounds of presentation. She called back the next morning. I could hear wind in the background and the rattle of silverware against a plate. I told her the card didn't work. I told her I had $19.43 left, and that I needed her to call the bank or send me money or something. There was a long pause. Then she said, slowly, like she was explaining something to a small animal, "The card is for emergencies, not for snacks. I gave you $20 because that is more than enough for a child who is mostly going to be eating what is already in the house. There's a chest freezer in the garage. There's canned goods in the pantry. Stop being lazy." I told her there were 2 cans of green beans in the pantry and a bag of frozen peas in the garage freezer. She said, "Then you will need to be creative." She hung up. I went to the chest freezer in the garage. There was, in fact, a bag of frozen peas. There were also 2 ice cube trays, a half-empty bottle of vodka, and a box of freezer-burned waffles from what looked like the previous summer. The pantry held the 2 cans of green beans, a tin of anchovies, a bottle of soy sauce, a jar of capers, and an unopened bag of basmati rice. The refrigerator had condiments and a single shriveled lemon. She had not just left me with $20. She had emptied the house before she went. I want you to understand the math here because I did the math at the kitchen island that night with a pencil and the back of a junk mail envelope. 21 days, $19.43, 92 cents per day. I was 12, and I had been on a roll in math the year before, and I knew that 92 cents would not buy 1 banana and a slice of bread in the same transaction. I knew this the way you know the temperature outside without checking a thermometer. I sat at the island and felt something in me get very cold and very organized. I rationed the bread first. 2 slices a day, 1 with peanut butter in the morning and 1 with peanut butter in the evening, and an apple split into quarters between them. I put the basmati rice on as soon as my supplies started thinning, and I learned to cook it on the stovetop by reading the back of the bag and burning the first pot black. I ate rice with soy sauce. I ate rice with anchovies, which I gagged on but did not throw up. I ate rice with capers and the bag of frozen peas, and I told myself it was a real meal and to be grateful. On the 5th night, I sat in the bathtub fully clothed and ran the hot water over my feet and cried for 40 minutes, which is the longest I had ever cried in my life, before or since. Nobody heard me. There was nobody in the house. There was nobody on the street outside who would have heard me even if I'd been screaming. The bath drained and I went to bed in my t-shirt with my hair still wet, and the next morning I made myself peanut butter toast and did not cry again for a long time. The woman who lived next door was named Mrs. Bellwether, and she was, I would guess, in her late 60s. She wore house dresses in a kind of faded pink and walked an enormous, wheezing English bulldog named Mr. Pym around the block every morning and every evening. She had lived in her house since before I was born. My mother thought she was tacky. My mother said this with the same tone she used to say a restaurant was tacky, which was the worst thing my mother could say about a person. Mrs. Bellwether knocked on our front door on day 6. I had not been expecting anyone, and when the knock came, I froze in the kitchen with a fork halfway to my mouth and tried to decide whether I was supposed to answer. Eventually she knocked again, and I went to the door and opened it 3 inches with the chain still on, the way my mother had taught me when I was very small. Mrs. Bellwether had a Tupperware container in her hands. She looked at me, and her eyes moved over my face in a way that adults' eyes do not usually move over a child's face, which is to say, carefully. "Sweetheart," she said, "I made too much chicken pot pie last night and Carl can't eat dairy anymore. Would you do me a favor and take some off my hands?" Carl was her husband, who I'd seen maybe 4 times in my life. I let her in. I didn't mean to. I think my body let her in before my mind had decided. She came into the kitchen and set the Tupperware on the counter, and she looked at the empty kitchen, and the single dish in the sink, and the bag of basmati rice on the counter, and the can of green beans that was open and half-eaten with a spoon still in it. And she did not say a single thing about any of it. She said, "Where's your mother, honey?" I told her. She said, "When?" I told her. She said, "And when do they come back?" I told her. She sat down at one of the kitchen stools, slowly, the way older people sit down. She put both her hands flat on the granite. She breathed out for a long time. Then she said, "All right. I'm not going to make a phone call yet, because I'm an old woman and I don't trust phone calls to get this right. But I'm going to do two things. The first thing is, you're going to come over to my house for dinner every night from now until they get back. You will sit at my kitchen table and eat real food. The second thing is, you are going to write down what has happened to you. Every day. With dates. With times. And I am going to help you keep that somewhere safe." I asked her why. She said, "Because nobody believes a child without a paper trail, baby. Nobody." That night, I ate chicken pot pie at Mrs. Bellwether's kitchen table while Mr. Pym snored under the chair next to me. Carl ate quietly at the other end. He did not ask me a single question. I think he had been told, in some silent way, that old married couples have, not to ask. After dinner, Mrs. Bellwether walked me back across our shared driveway and told me to lock the door behind me and to call her landline if anything at all happened in the night. I started the journal that night. I used a marble composition notebook from my school supplies. I wrote down the date, June 19th, and I wrote down what had been in the kitchen when they left and what was in the kitchen now and how much money I had and what I had eaten that day and what my mother had said on the phone. I wrote it the way I had been taught to write a science lab report. Observation. Data. Conclusion. I also took photographs. The fridge. The pantry. The chest freezer. The folded receipt from Publix with the $20 payment circled in pencil. I emailed them to myself from the family iPad so that there would be a timestamp, and then I emailed copies to Mrs. Bellwether's email address, which she had written on a paper towel and pressed into my palm. She had said, "The thing about a paper trail is that there needs to be more than one of you carrying it." On day 11, I called my mother again because I had run out of bread and rice both, and the peas were gone, and I had $8.12 in cash. She answered this time, and I could hear voices in Italian behind her, men's voices, laughing, and the clink of glassware. I told her the situation. She said, "Sweetheart, I am in the middle of a dinner. I cannot have this conversation right now. Eat what is in the house." I said, "There is nothing in the house." She said, "There is always something in the house." She said, "There is always something in the house if you are willing to be a grown-up about it." I said, "Please." There was a pause. Then her voice changed, the way it changed when she was about to say something she had been planning. She said, "Listen to me very carefully. If I get one more phone call from you complaining like this, if I find out that you have called Bo or me or anyone else on this trip with a little dramatic emergency, I am going to come home and I am going to send you to live with your grandmother in Macon. And you will not be coming back to this house. Do you understand me? This is what I get for trying to have one nice thing." My grandmother in Macon had died 2 years before. My mother knew this. My mother had been at the funeral. The threat was not really a threat. It was just a sentence designed to remind me that I had no other landing place, that the bottom of the well had no bottom, and that I was supposed to be quiet about it. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She hung up. I walked over to Mrs. Bellwether's house and I knocked on the door, and when she opened it, I told her, word for word, what my mother had said. She had me write it down. She had me write down what I had eaten that day and what time my mother had called and the time difference to wherever in Italy she was, and we figured out together that my mother had taken the phone call from a restaurant dinner because the timing didn't match anything else. Mrs. Bellwether called her own daughter that night, who was a paralegal in Atlanta. The daughter came down the next weekend and sat with me in Mrs. Bellwether's kitchen and asked me questions in a gentle, professional way that I now recognize as the way someone takes a statement. She wrote everything down. She took copies of my journal pages. She made me re-photograph the kitchen with her standing in the frame, so there was a witness. On day 15, I fainted in the cereal aisle of the Publix while trying to do the math on whether I could afford a box of off-brand cornflakes. I came to on the floor with my cheek against the cold tile, and a manager in a green apron crouched over me, and a paramedic walking through the automatic doors with a bag over his shoulder. They had called an ambulance. I had not been able to give them a phone number that worked because Loretta had given up answering my calls and my mother's phone went straight to voicemail. The paramedic asked me when I had last eaten a meal. "A real meal," he said. "Not a snack." I told him about the chicken pot pie. I told him that was 3 nights ago. I told him about the rice and the peas and the anchovies and the bread, and I watched his face the way I had watched the cashier's face on day 2, and I saw something I had not seen before, which was an adult deciding, in real time, that something was not okay. He asked me where my parents were. I told him. He asked me who I lived with. I told him. He said, "Sweetheart, I have to call somebody." I said, "Please call Mrs. Bellwether first." He did. She came in her house dress with her purse, and she brought the marble composition notebook, and she sat in the small fluorescent room with me at the back of the supermarket while a social worker arrived from a county office I had never heard of. The social worker was a woman with short gray hair and rectangular glasses, named Miens Quiñone. She read 3 pages of the notebook and then she closed it very gently, the way you close a book you want to come back to later, and she said, "All right, let's go to your house. I want to see it for myself." She walked through every room. She opened the refrigerator. She opened the freezer. She opened the pantry. She took her own photographs. She found the unopened envelope with the debit card and she called the bank from my kitchen island on her own cell phone and verified that the card had been ordered and then deliberately left inactive. The note in the system said, "Do not activate per customer request." The customer was my mother. Ms. Quiñones took me to a foster placement that night with a couple in their 50s named the Kowalskis, who had a daughter in college and a guest room with a yellow quilt on the bed. She told me in the car on the way over that I would be safe and that nobody was going to make me go back into that house alone again. I cried the whole drive. I had not cried since the bathtub on day 5. Miss Quiñones did not say anything. She just turned the air conditioning down so that I would not be too cold, and she let me cry. My mother and Beau were tracked down 4 days later in London at the conference. They had been notified repeatedly by Ms. Quiñones and by an officer of the family court in Chatham County that there was a welfare investigation open on their 12-year-old child, and they were instructed to return to the United States immediately. They did not. They finished the conference. They took the flight they had originally booked 3 days after that. My mother arrived at the front door of our house on a Sunday afternoon, dragging her rolling suitcase with her hair pinned up and her sunglasses pushed back on her head. She had ordered a car from the airport. She walked up the path and she put her key in the lock and she opened the door and the house behind her was full of people. There was Miss Quiñones, and a uniformed officer from Chatham County and a representative from the Department of Family and Children's Services and a court-appointed attorney named Mr. Halberd who had been assigned to me. Mrs. Bellwether was sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, in her good blue church dress. Her daughter, the paralegal, was next to her with a manila folder. The marble composition notebook was on the coffee table. My mother stopped in the doorway. Beau, behind her, set the suitcase down very slowly, like a man trying not to startle a horse. She said, "What is this?" Miss Quiñones stood up. She said, "Ma'am, please come inside and sit down. We have a great deal to discuss with you." My mother did not sit down. She looked from face to face and her own face moved through 3 or 4 expressions before it settled on a kind of bright, social smile that I knew from years of dinner parties. She said, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. My daughter has always been a bit imaginative. She's been through a lot, with her father, you know." Mr. Halberd opened the manila folder. He read out loud, in the same flat voice that adults use to read court documents anywhere, the dates of her absence, the financial records they had pulled, the amount Beau had charged on his American Express in Italy and London, which was just over $38,000, and the confirmed status of the debit card she had given me, which was "Do not activate per customer request." He read the photographs into the record: refrigerator, pantry, chest freezer. He read the medical record from the emergency room visit, including my weight, which had dropped 7 pounds in 14 days. He read 3 entries from the composition notebook, in my own handwriting, in chronological order, including the one in which I had written down word for word what my mother had said about sending me to a dead grandmother. The room was very quiet. My mother looked at me then, for the first time since she had come through the door. She looked at me and I saw, very clearly, that she was calculating. She was trying to decide which version of herself to be in the next 60 seconds. I watched her pick. She turned to Ms. Minens, Quiñones, and she said, in a voice gone soft and trembling, "I have been under a tremendous amount of stress. My marriage has not been easy. I should not have left her alone. I see that now. If you let me have her back, I will get her into therapy. I will do whatever you need." Bo, behind her, did not say anything. He had not said anything since he set the suitcase down. He was, I realized, looking at the floor in a way that I recognized, because it was the way he had always looked at the floor when my mother was performing. "Miss Tell," Quiñones said. "Ma'am, this is no longer a conversation about whether you can have her back. This is a conversation about charges." My mother sat down on the arm of the sofa, which she had told me 100 times not to sit on. She put her hand to her mouth. The hearing happened 6 weeks later. Bo hired a lawyer for himself first, and then for my mother, and the two lawyers tried to push the blame back and forth between them like a hot potato. Bo's lawyer wanted to argue that he had assumed the housekeeper was checking on me. My mother's lawyer wanted to argue that I had refused to go to my aunt's house in Charleston, an aunt I had not seen since I was 8 and who had not been contacted by anyone before the trip. The judge, a soft-spoken woman with reading glasses on a chain, was not interested in either argument. She read the photographs into the record again. She read the medical report. She read 2 entries from the notebook. She sentenced my mother to 14 months in state custody and Bo to 10, with credit for time served and supervised probation upon release. She terminated their parental rights at the same hearing in a separate proceeding and granted permanent custody to my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Bess, who lived in a small house in a town outside of Asheville called Black Mountain, and who I had only met twice but who had driven down the moment Miss Quiñones had reached her. Aunt Bess had a husband named Mick who taught middle school history and 2 cats and an old golden retriever who was almost completely deaf. The guest room she gave me had a quilt her own mother had made, and a window that looked out into a yard full of rhododendron bushes, and a small desk where I did my homework every night for 6 years. I am 23 now. I just finished my 2nd year of law school at the University of North Carolina. I am going to be a children's advocate. I knew this by the time I was 15. I knew it the way you know what your own name is. My mother wrote me a letter from the women's facility about 8 months in. She wrote me again a year after she got out. She wrote me again last Christmas. The letters are in a shoebox in the top of my closet. I have read each of them once. She apologizes in the letters, in the careful, performative way she apologizes for everything, and she also, in each letter, includes one sentence that explains why what she did was not really her fault. The most recent letter blamed Bo, who she divorced in the 2nd month of her sentence. The one before that blamed her own mother. The one before that blamed me, very gently, the way you might blame a kitchen appliance for being inconvenient. I have not written back. I am not sure I ever will. People ask me sometimes whether I forgive her, and I have learned to say, that is the wrong question, because forgiveness is a private weather that happens inside a person, and what she actually needs from me is a relationship, and a relationship is a contract, and I will not sign that contract. Mrs. Bellwether passed away during my 1st semester of law school. Aunt Bess drove me down to Savannah for the funeral. Mr. Pym had died 2 years before her. Carl was in a memory care facility by then and did not really know who I was when I held his hand. The composition notebook is in my desk drawer at school, and the photographs are backed up in 3 places, and the email chain with the timestamps is still in my inbox, and I do not think I will ever delete any of it, not because I need it anymore, but because she told me once, that night at her kitchen table with the chicken pot pie steaming between us, that nobody believes a child without a paper trail. She was right about that, and she was right about other things too. She was right that the silence my mother demanded of me was not, in fact, the price of belonging. It was the price of her getting away with it. There is a difference, and it took me until I was about 16 to feel that difference in my bones, but I feel it now, and I will spend my career standing in front of judges on behalf of children who have not yet learned to feel it. If you are listening to this, and you are in a house right now where you have been taught that being a good child means making yourself smaller, that the way to keep love is to never need anything, that your hunger or your loneliness or your fear is an inconvenience to the adults around you. I want you to hear me very carefully. The adults around you are wrong. There is a Mrs. Bellwether somewhere on your block, or in your school, or behind a desk at a county office 2 miles from where you sit, and her job, whether she knows it or not, is to believe you. Your job is to find her. Write down what is happening to you. Take the photographs. Email yourself the timestamps. Tell one person, and if that person doesn't believe you, tell another, and another, and another, until somebody does. Because somebody will. And when they do, the house you thought you had to be quiet in will not be the house you live in anymore, and you will find out, the way I did, that there are kitchens in this world where the chair pulled out for you is pulled out on purpose, and the food on the plate is for you on purpose. And the woman across the table looks at you when you speak. That is what a family is supposed to feel like. I did not know that until I was 12.5 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in Black Mountain, North Carolina, eating spaghetti that my aunt had made from a recipe her own mother used to make, while the deaf old dog snored on a rug at my feet. I know it now. I think about that summer more than I let on. Not the hunger, not the rice burning in the pot, not the bathtub on day 5. I think about the moment Mrs. Bellwether set the Tupperware down on our granite island and asked me where my mother was, and I told her the truth without dressing it up. That moment is the hinge my whole life turns on, and I did not know it at the time. What I have come to understand, slowly over the years and through every law school seminar on family court, is that nothing in my mother's life was an accident. Not the inactivated debit card, not the empty pantry, not the dead grandmother she threatened me with. She made each of those choices on purpose, and each of those choices had a consequence that grew the way a small crack grows in a windshield. She wanted a quiet child who would not embarrass her, and the universe gave her, eventually, a quiet courtroom and a judge who read photographs of an empty refrigerator into the record. That is cause and effect. That is what people mean when they say what you put into the world is what comes back to find you. It is not magic. It is just arithmetic, played out over months instead of seconds. The thing I want you to take from my story, if you take anything, is that the 3 things that saved me were not luck. They were a kind of character, and character is something you build on purpose. The first was honesty. When Mrs. Bellwether asked me where my mother was, I did not lie to protect a woman who had not protected me. That was an ethical choice, and 12-year-old me made it without knowing she was making it. The second was clear thinking. I did the math at the kitchen island on the back of a junk mail envelope, and I wrote down dates and times the way Mrs. Bellwether told me to, because she was right that the truth has to be carried by something more durable than memory. That was an intellectual choice. I made it because I had been taught, by school and by accident, that careful observation matters, and the third was endurance. I ate the rice, I rationed the bread. I walked to Publix in the heat. I called my mother again when calling her had stopped working because giving up was not an available option. That was a choice about willpower, and I made it 21 days in a row without anyone clapping for me. I want my own kids someday to understand that those 3 things, honesty and clear thinking and the refusal to quit, are not gifts you are born with. They are muscles, and Mrs. Bellwether taught me how to lift the first set of weights. Aunt Bess kept the gym open after that. The work is mine now, and I do it every morning in small ways, the way you brush your teeth. That is what 12 taught me. That is what I carry,